Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about some of my thoughts for Mythic Plus, what they could be doing to revamp the affixes, what are some of the plans that they have in the here and now as we get ready for 10.1, and how I think that they could be changing Mythic Plus in a greater way when it comes to a new expansion. A few things have been with affixes in particular when it comes to the beneficial side. I know Blizzard has said this like time and time again, but I want to reiterate, as much as I would be in favor of having some beneficial affixes or a little bit more like Kiss Curse when it comes into dealing with those affixes, they pretty solidly are against that, and they see that as like the opposite of what they would want when it comes to affixes. They want things to be more challenging, and they didn't directly cite encrypted, but the recent QA that they just put up on Wowhead talking about affixes and like the beneficial versus Kiss Curse, they made a point to reference certain seasonal affixes at the level 10 level, making dungeons substantially easier so that a completion rate of 10s was much higher than 9s. So as much as I'd be a fan of it, that's not part of what I want to advocate. It probably was some affixes like encrypted, which were amazing in terms of the power they could give you, that were probably the cause of some of that, which is ironic because I think that encrypted was probably one of the most loved affixes that we had. Certainly one of the most loved seasonal affixes that we had. But anyway, Season 2 coming up around the corner, and there is no seasonal affix coming into the mix. Personally, I think that's probably for the best after we saw Thundering. I think a lot of the seasonal affixes feel very rushed, and they have felt very... For lack of a better word, they've been very underwhelming, I think, for a while. I think Encrypted was really good, but the last two seasons with Thundering and then Shrouded, both of them felt really meager by comparison and didn't seem like it had like the full attention when it came to how this affix system is going to work and how we can play around it. It was just like very basic on its head. So going forward, I guess we'll see, although I am quite disappointed that we're not going to have any sort of Kiss Curse type benefit for it. I still am in favor of removing Fort and Tyrannical, but I think that's definitely going to be a next expansion type project. But I would love it if they are just having better balance for trash mobs and for boss fights. I've seen boss encounters like Talixay Flame Wreath in Court of Stars get killed on fortified weeks in like a minute because you could just steamroll the boss. I think they did it in like a 24 or 25, just like kill the boss in like a minute. And then you have the Tyrannical week where it will take 2.5 minutes or more, depending on, you know, how your DPS are playing, of course. And it's just weird. It's just really weird to have this sort of like jarring feeling week to week in terms of what you're facing. And I think it also reflects in fortified environments when you have to deal with like trash enemies, where it seems like on some weeks, the Blazebound Destroyer in Ruby Life Pools deals like no damage whatsoever, and then you don't really notice as much if a cast goes off. You go into fortified weeks, or fortified like bolstering weeks, or fortified raging weeks. I think that's one of those. There's definitely a fortified bolster week. And then the mobs just annihilate you by comparison. And so that the affix system as it stands right now can also lend itself to these sort of synergistic affix combinations on certain weeks where you can have mobs that are fortified and they're bolstered, so they're getting even more health and even more damage on top of them, which seems like it should never, ever happen, but it seems to. I think removing Fort and Tyrannical would help remove that sort of jarring effect for some of the enemies, but you could also make it so that Fort and Tyrannical don't give any sort of damage or health buffs to the enemies, and they just have a baseline level, and then Fort and Tyrannical instead could just be adding like extra mechanics into the mix. They already talked about how they wanted to reduce a lot of the extra casts or all the involvement where there's just every mob doing something, but I think that what you could do is try to find a decent middle ground where you're reducing some of those things and having some of them only included in a fortified week, and then some of the additional casts like the Cinder Bolts or something like that might cast a little bit faster on fortified weeks or might have a lower cooldown on fortified weeks, but on a Tyrannical week they will just cast like 50% less often or 30% less often or something along those lines, so you're reducing some of the pressure. If in this example, Fort and Tyrannical weren't adding health or damage to the enemies, and they always had a similar baseline level of both, then that also means that certain mobs that you really want to be deadly and you really want to be challenging, or like mini bosses, the way we see them with the elementals in Ruby Life Pools, they could also just be deadly the entire way throughout. I think when it comes to like a tyrannical environment, you could start adding in some more simple mechanics. Say you had like the winds or the Tempest Storm boss in Nakud Offensive, you could just start making winds to dodge or something like that during lightning storms. You could have different kinds of weapons that you have to utilize on Granith that are having different effects. Tyran Maruk could just be summoning other undead adds that you'd have to kill in time, something along those lines. It's not overly intrusive, but it just makes it so that it's another mechanic that you need to be mindful of without having the boss fight go a minute plus longer than the previous week because of these health and damage explosions that really sort of happen. One of the problems I see just in general with this season of Mythic Plus, but it's sort of been trending in this direction as well, is that there seems to be a very large reduction in just overall mechanics that you have to do when it comes to a lot of these dungeons. So much of it is stops and trying to kill off like the prio target mobs quickly enough, or trying to like push together pulls that are very difficult to work with. You see it in like Temple of the Jade Serpent, for example, when it comes to the end part of the dungeon. You'll have like the Mistweavers in the courtyard as well as in the final boss room. They're going to have the curse that needs to be dispelled, and if you pull 2 of them, you just need to have 2 curse dispels to be able to deal with it. And that's kind of the limiting factor. You'll have some of the more deadly casts that the Mistweavers can do as well, which is channel and can kill you. But overall, there's certain mechanics that sort of just stop you from progressing into the dungeon, stop you from moving on into the dungeon. And I think that those can be especially toxic when it looks at extra mechanics you have to deal with. Because there's not really any extra skill in bringing 2 curse dispels into a dungeon so you can go faster. It just, yay, my composition is right for these mobs. What I'd vastly prefer is if there were more side mechanics that kind of everybody had to do. I'm not the biggest fan of this specific mechanic, but in Nakud Offensive, when you're fighting under the burial mounds, for example, they'll shoot up your souls and you get a damage down and you have to go collect it. Obviously, nobody likes having damage downs, but it's a mechanic that actually pushes the entire party to actually interact with it, sans the tank, and makes it so that everybody's sort of involved in dealing with the trash pack, because sitting around eating a damage down is, of course, going to make the pull take forever, and so you're taking action based off what the enemies are giving you, based off what the mobs are giving you. I think a positive effect would be something like we saw out of Spires of Ascension last expansion, where if you purge the right minion, then you'll be able to grab their weapon and use it to deal more damage against enemies. I think that'd be a good way to do it as well, where the actual mechanics of the mobs are not just area denial and absolute like nukes, which will kill players, or like things like dispels. Just having the right type of dispels on hand to be able to deal with these mechanics. Those things, I think, in general, for how dungeon design works, would actually be a very big net positive. I think it is a good thing to actually have the need for the entire party, sort of like we see out of Underrot when we get into Underrot testing. I think a really good example of it is Cragmaw, where the boss will shed all these little maggots that you need to stomp on really quickly. It's something everybody has to be involved in and everybody has to sort of do together. I think those are examples of good mechanics, and I would like to see them mixed more into trash mobs rather than all of it being about, well, let's see how many stuns, kicks, interrupts, and dispels that we can have to kill all these mobs, stack as many of them on top of each other, and just AoE until our lights go out. It would actually be a lot better if you had to fight up against potential damage down mechanics, damage up mechanics, vulnerability windows, to grab mobs together, execute mechanics properly, and get a damage buff or get a reward for performing it properly. I think that would be a huge up for how just dungeons are designed in general. One of the biggest things that I've also noticed throughout this season of M+, but also in prior seasons, but probably this most of all, is that healers kind of take on almost every affix. I think Sanguine is probably one of the few that the healer sometimes cannot interact with. Evokers, of course, druids, shamans have their knockbacks, but something like Priest, for example, does not, and so you're not really able to play along with that. But one of the biggest things that this season has emphasized is how much the healer has to interact with mechanics so that other players don't. Historically, Explosive was like an affix that most affected like rogues, because rogues were a spec that could actually kill the explosive in one global because it had a decent amount of health, and they could have Blade Flurry up and keep on cleaving, and everything would be fine and dandy. You also would have certain tanks be able to work off it, like a Blood DK could like Heart Strike them and almost always kill it in one go, and then be able to still cleave enemies, do damage, you name it. Now that the explosive is able to be one-shot, it starts falling into the healer, because the most important thing for the completion of dungeons at really high key levels is honestly just doing enough damage. The main gate for like the world first level keys is having enough damage on these trash pulls to be able to kill the enemies in time before defensives for your tank or your party or whatever run out. And so it is the best strategy at high levels to have your healer kill everything. That's not the end of the world, but I think it is presented in the fact that DPS aren't as involved with the overall mechanics of the dungeon or the affixes themselves, and that you have a certain feature in the game to make your life harder that is imbalanced in its impact on the roles in your group. And so if most of the explosive responsibility, 80-90% of it, goes to one spec, then you're only having one class out of the 5 that are getting brought into the dungeon interacting with something, which also doesn't feel like the point of the affixes. It feels like it should be something the entire group is taking on. And so that's where an affix like explosive might just be outdated entirely, and I would think so. But it also could be looking for a redesign. Quaking, for example, is not a very hard affix to deal with when you're a melee player. But when you have 4 melee in a group and you're having like a Mistweaver monk and your tank and 2 melee DPS, it's really annoying to deal with, and you notice it. And so affixes that are potentially interrupting casters can also have an impact on melee. And so I'm surprised that explosive still sort of exists in this format, that it is almost entirely at high levels given to the healer to be able to have responsibility over. At like, you know, obviously like mid levels, you probably see the tanks helping out. I'm sure a lot of people are absolutely helping out with explosives, and they should, because when you're not at the highest level of keys, you just need to like not wipe, have some decent execution onto your pulls, spread out your cooldowns accordingly, and do your thing. Which also brings us to the level 7 affix bucket. That is of Quaking, Grievous, Volcanic, Storming, and Explosive. This bucket of affixes, these 5, they said, are all being looked at to how you wanted to change around how they interact with the entire affix system, whether they're going to add some, remove some, you name it. Personally, I am in massive favor of the removal of explosive, because even if they made it so that it involved the entire group, it would still probably just be a massive inconvenience for everybody to deal with. Nobody wants to kill explosives. Some people probably want explosives to stay the same so that their healer can deal with it and they never have to. Overall, I think this affix doesn't really add anything to the table. It feels more like I'm playing some kind of like orientation game with like the smart board that I would have back in grade school, where I just gotta like hit the dots fast enough before time runs out. Does it actually express any sort of skill or any sort of challenge for the entire group? No, it just favors healers that are very mana efficient, and they can do their healing in very concentrated windows when they have less globals. Huzzah! Wow. When it comes to Grievous, I actually think Grievous is fine. And, you know, for us being a healer channel, you guys may not like me for that, but I quite frankly think Grievous is fine. Even as a Disc Priest, I don't think it's that bad. Especially with the changes to direct healing, removing stacks of Grievous that they had, I think, last expansion, if not the one before that. That's been wonderful. I think it was actually in BFA that they changed a number of that around. But anyway, I think that stuff's fine. Actually, no, it was Shadowlands. Volcanic, Storming, and Quaking, they all kind of impact the group in a variety of ways, but I feel like Volcanic is almost too easy to deal with. Unless you're having range like stacking up into very specific areas, it overall doesn't feel like Volcanic has too much pressure to the group, the way I would argue that like Storming actually does have a lot of impact, especially if you have anybody who has to like cast spells in melee, or they might have like a channel that they're trying to get done, or if you're trying to kick or interrupt specific mobs and Storming knocks you into the air right out of range and then a cast goes off. I think Storming does have a lot more noticeable of an impact than you would think, while Volcanic, and I would even argue Quaking, don't have nearly as much. So though the big affix that I think that they should remove would definitely be Explosive, and then when it comes to Volcanic, maybe that could be made slightly more deadly or slightly more challenging to deal with. How it scales with a number of mobs, I think, should always be looked at, because sometimes you pull a massive trash pack together and then you just have like 20 Volcanics going off at once, and other times you might have like one and nothing else So how they balance those affixes, I think, would be very valuable, because we have had pretty good affix weeks, but there's always something that sort of gets in the way, that feels inconvenient, and it feels like there's always some challenges that you need to overcome. And in order to best accomplish overcoming those challenges, you do whatever you can as a healer to be able to make the DPS lives easier and to make their lives as smooth as possible, while you take care of mechanics, affixes, obviously healing, personal management, all of that, mitigation management, just to make sure that they're able to do the maximum amount of DPS, because that's the biggest challenge that you have to deal with. There's, in my opinion, not enough pressure in dungeons onto like the DPS to do mechanics or help with mechanics or have everybody be challenged to contribute towards those affixes. And as a result, there's a very uneven amount of the burden being carried as a result. I think tanks experience that a lot when it comes to routing, but they've also done a lot to make routing more simple than it had been prior in like BFA, for example. It was a lot more complex. There was a lot of skips involved, for example. When you had the rogue, it really opened up a lot of possibilities for how you could adjust your routes for the most efficient percent. They've reined that in since then, but overall, I think there still exists a really imbalanced measurement of who is dealing with the affixes and whose responsibility it is for the affix. When it comes to high-level dungeons, there's too much focus on sort of just timing pulls of being able to annihilate packs super quickly before the mechanics that they have go off, rather than having mechanics that are more than just area denial or void zones or dispels. Things that are, okay, we'll just bring the right things to counter it, bring the right amount of interrupts, bring the right dispels, and I'd much prefer it if there were more so affixes, or sorry, mechanics that we've seen out of things, like I said, in No Coup Defensive, where everybody is afflicted by something and everybody is taking part into it, so that everybody is learning the mechanics and everybody is expected to perform or to help out. I think those things would actually make the game vastly better, and having greater personal responsibility added into Mythic Plus, beyond just interrupting and using a defensive and using offensives, would actually be pretty good for the game. Overall, let me know what you guys think for what you'd like to see change for Mythic Plus. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot as 10.1 comes up around the corner. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hope you all enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time.